We're about to start the second session for today, and it's my pleasure to begin to introduce our speakers for this session. This session is, as rightly titled, is Kenya, Tanzania. And the first topic will be Canada's human rights moments in Kenya's constitutional transformation agenda by Professor Sylvia Kangari. The correction has been made that she used to be at University of Washington, but she's now the Dean of Law at Riari University in Nairobi, Kenya. So she'll be speaking to that topic. Then the next speaker would be Canada and Tanzania Human Rights Engagement, a Critical Assessment of Literature and a Research Agenda by Ms. Juliana Gambagimbe. Sorry if I mispronounce your name. She's Obi again noted that she is in fact a lecturer at Iringa University. And the third speaker would be, which talks about who will remember children, the international human rights movement and juvenile justice in Africa. Professor Fasil Baha and Christina Kandia would then, both of them are co-presenting from my understanding. So what I want to do quickly is, I think we all have between 15 to 20 minutes, and we'll try and keep to time. We just want to invite Professor Sylvia to the floor and to begin the first set of presentation. Please join me in welcoming her.
Good afternoon. A sunny, beautiful afternoon. So glad to be here. So grateful also to Professor Okafor and the organizers, Kalu, who has been in touch and working behind the scenes to make sure that, and behind the scenes as well, because deadlines were missed and all that, to make sure that all the infractions, and for your patience. So grateful for that. And it's wonderful to meet you all, many of you for the first time. It's just so awesome to have you, to meet you in this conference. It's been full of energy, felt very much at home. I've been to conferences where I felt like a total stranger, but you guys have just been awesome, and I thank you so much. So my paper, and I have a paper, and I'll try to go through it quickly because I know I won't have enough time to go through it slowly. So you will pardon me, and hopefully what doesn't come out clearly, you can ask at question time. So it has two parts. The first part, I'm going to look at Kenya's 3 human rights moments, just touch and go. And these 3 human rights moments are the moment of the neo-colonial critique of human rights, the pro-democracy activism moment, and the judicial promotion of constitutionalism and jurisprudential growth. Those are Kenya's, in my view, 3 human rights moments. Then I ask the question, in those 3 moments, has Canada had its moments? So Canada's moments in Kenya's moments, if you can bear with me for that. And I am going to look at Canadian, I don't know whether to call them interventions, contributions, role in these moments. That's what I set out to do when I was asked to undertake this project. I have to say I was very worried that I wasn't finding a lot of information. So if what I present to you sounds very basic, I found very basic. Hopefully there's more that will be discovered along the way or that will come out from the work we do here. Because I'm talking about moments, I'm also talking about history. And it is important for us to think about our history for 3 reasons. History allows us to consider the emergence of legal ideas and their influence in terms of how they might have influenced current moments or past moments that I've talked about. I think it is also bad manners to ignore history, because then we're ignoring our forebearers and we can learn from their experiences. So that's another reason to have history on. Third is that history is resistance. And when we look at these moments from a historical perspective, we know that in the human rights world or in the human rights experience, some people's histories have been erased. And therefore, a look at history is also a bringing back some things that might be lost or some voices that might not have been heard. So that's why I'm giving you the 3 moments. Now, the neocolonialism critique of human rights. So arguments about neocolonialism, and this is, as you know, a term coined by Nkrumah of Ghana, connote resistance to continued Western domination of newly independent states around the 50s and 60s. So the critique was leveled, the neocolonialism critique was leveled at human rights because at that time of decolonization, human rights became an important new frontier for Western engagement with non-Western peoples. Pan-Africanists focused on issues of economic self-determination, respect of cultures, as well as respect for religious rights of non-Westerners to front the neocolonialism critique. I'll be saying more about that if there will be time. Now, on the second moment, the pro-democracy activism. So 4 things are important. So we've shifted gears really quickly, right? So now we are talking about pro-democracy, not neocolonial critique. So there are about 4 things here about the pro-democracy movement. So you had the Pan-Africanists pushing economic self-determination. It was right after independence, the whole neocolonialism arguments that you are aware of. But maybe we also had another moment, which is the pro-democracy activism moment. Neocolonial critiques focused externally to Western powers. Pro-democracy activism was more internal, and here we see support from Western powers. So the pro-democracy movement was against dictatorships that emerged after independence. For Kenya, it was a march from the one-party state to the multi-party state. And this was between 1960, you could say, to 1990s, when Kenya became a multi-party state by law. But multi-partyism in Kenya unleashed conflicts, right? Conflicts between minority tribes and big tribes. And these conflicts revolved around economic distribution of resources, as well as distribution of political power. So minority tribes were arguing that big tribes are dominant and repressive. Third, in this pro-democracy moment, there was also the women's rights movement, which during the era of multipartyism accelerated and consolidated its gains. It had started in the 70s with the UN, Decade of Women, and 1980s and so on. But in the multipartyism era, it gained momentum and became part of the resistance against dictatorship. Fourth, we had a change. The constitution movement emerged from multipartyism. Because even though the country became a multi-party state, repression continued, okay? The thing about the change the constitution movement is that it managed to bring together divergent interests. women's rights, minority tribes versus big tribes, and so on, and other, self-determination questions, internal self-determination questions. So we'll change gears again. And now I'll touch and go with regards to judicial developments, promotion of the constitution, and jurisprudential growth. So the constitution movement actually succeeded because Kenya passed a new constitution in 2010. The new constitutional framework has the following progressive provisions, many of which were not in the old constitution. A Bill of Rights that combines political and economic rights, protections for land ownership, including community land rights, which before didn't exist, and limitations on foreign acquisition of land, environment and sustainable development, devolution of power and resources to alternative governments or county governments, regulation of foreign investment, including in the area of mining, protection of communities and culture, domestication of international law. The Constitution says international law is part of Kenyan law, public participation in decision-making and governance as a requirement for a lot of things, decisions made, constitutional commissions as vehicles of governance, and maybe I should also mention making sure that these provisions are not just in paper, they're actually justiciable. You could go to court, challenge a decision, for example, by claiming there wasn't sufficient public participation. Okay. Are you happy so far? So what I'm going to do now is ask. We have talked about 3 moments: neocolonial, pro-democracy movements, and judicial constitutionalism and development of jurisprudence. Does Canada feature in any of these ideas or moments? Was there any, Canada's moments in these Kenyan moments? So I start by pointing out that Canada has had human rights projects and interventions in Kenya. And to substantiate that or to give you information, I'll probably just touch and go also. As a matter of international relations and diplomacy, Kenya, of course, has a High Commission in Kenya, but what's important to note is that that High Commission serves 4 countries in addition to Kenya. That is Rwanda, Uganda, Burundi, and Somalia. Canada represented, and the High Commission also is, or Commissioner is Canada's representative to the UN office in Nairobi, which houses UNEP and UN Habitat headquarters. This centralization of diplomatic functions in Nairobi is noteworthy because it shows Canada's recognition of Kenya's significance in the geopolitics of the region. It also reflects Kenya's international human rights obligations, for instance, with regard to refugees, environmental risks, human trafficking, drug trafficking. There's a corridor there, the East Africa corridor, money laundering, wildlife crimes, humanitarian relief, and counterterrorism. Kenya's legislative and judicial development is beginning to reflect, greater embrace of human rights than ever before. The traditional confinement of human rights to donor relations is giving way to an approach involving more actors speaking to more issues, so not just the government. Yes, there has been Canadian support for democracy and governance, and here we might flag this as civil and political rights. So the issue of democracy and good governance, the Canadian International Development Agency has contributed substantial amounts to support civil society groups to demand accountability, transparency, and so on. What is noteworthy, given the moments outlined for you, Canadian engagement with democratic governance problems in Kenya dates back to the 80s and 90s, so you will recall the pro-democracy movement. At that time, retired President Moi engineered a constitutional amendment in 1982 that made Kenya a one-party state. What followed were, of course, egregious human rights abuses. And Canada allowed Kenyan human rights activists fleeing the regime to be exiled in Canada. As a result, President Moi recalled Kenya's High Commissioner to Canada. And this was the first time Kenya recalled its diplomatic representative due to support accorded to persons in political exiles by foreign governments. So when Kenya became a multi-party state, Canada, alongside the US and Germany, mounted pressure on the Moi regime, leading eventually to the amendments to the law that brought multi-party democracy. So Canada supported Kenya's constitutional review process. This is the third, movement, the movement to change the constitution. And it did this by providing consultants for the review commission, providing documentation, helping consensus building. Remember, I mentioned the diverse interests, and everybody needed to come to the table to bring forth the new constitution. It has also supported voter education programs. And as I was thinking about this, I was thinking about Trump and Russia and how, a foreign government, whether it's fashionable anymore to say that a foreign country is supporting elections in another country. But in Kenya, it has happened. So increased citizen participation and so on. You're familiar with the human rights interventions regarding electoral reform. And that also goes to gender equality questions. Now, another area is corruption in government that now has become a human rights issue. In 2010, the Kenyan Ministry of Education lost more than $2 million Canadian dollars, donated by CEDA. The money was intended for textbooks and other educational programs, but was lost through corruption. And CEDA made a press statement that the money would be recovered from the government in an effort by Canadians to take a stance against corruption in a very particularized context. Canada also has funding called the Canadian Funding for Local Initiatives Program. This goes directly to small groups and small community activism. And of course, this raises a question, highlights the point that it's no longer government-to-government engagement. There is a Canadian government going directly and funding small groups. Canada, okay, good, thank you. Canada's close working relationship with Kenyan NGOs was made clear in 2015 when the Canadian High Commission officials condemned the government's blacklisting of some Kenyan NGOs for what authorities had termed as lack of compliance with the law, stating that civil society organizations are critical in engaging citizens in their country's decision-making processes. So there was intervention on behalf of NGOs that had been blacklisted by the government. Because of time, I have mentioned Canadian interventions with regard to political and civil rights. There is also intervention in poverty alleviation and development, social and economic rights, and my paper, if you have access to it, highlights interventions touching on health, water, sanitation, and hygiene issues, education sector, and then there is also non-traditional interventions on behalf of vulnerable and marginalized groups, and this would bring in the minority tribes question, so indigenous groups who are not in the mainstream economy, contributing towards them, as well as protection of vulnerable girls in those communities, children with disability, and so on. And I might note that as Canadian support for vulnerable groups is taking place, there is also increased litigation in our courts with regards to questions of minority status that I might have time to mention, but you can see from my paper. But maybe, okay, thank you. Okay, so another area in addition to vulnerable and minority groups is business and technology, which is a new intervention in the area of human rights. So this is, Canada is supporting the Digital Opportunity Trust, which aims to support young African women and men to lead economic changes in order to create new enterprises and raise individual and family incomes. So money for business development and so on. Another area that's important is the rights of refugees in the Dadaab refugee camp. But that is complicated by the fact that Kenya's government thinks that the Dadaab refugee camp is actually a national security threat because of terrorism. And therefore, there has been conflict with regards to Kenya wanting to shut down the Dadaab camp, which has been in existence, I think, for 20 years now. And the question, can they really return to Somalia if the country hasn't been stabilized yet? So those are the interventions. I'm not done. I'll leave you with two more things, but thank you. I know it's afternoon. As you think about those interventions, my own thinking was towards, okay, very good, but are there problems that we can't see? It's all good when you see the dollar sums and you see photos on the Canadian website where girls have been liberated or whatever it is. But from a human rights theory perspective, what are the challenges that we are having to confront? So my paper goes into a discussion about the origins of human rights and whether the neocolonialism critique still obtains. Are these interventions done with imperialist bias, for example, as a question? Then, so you may want to think about things I didn't touch on, including Canada's positioning in the question of political rights versus economic rights. When you have businesses, Canadian businesses in a country, you are inclined not to support the economic rights of locals because you want maximum benefit for those communities. So the question is, has Canada been supporting its own business interests, supporting business reform laws that promote Canadian businesses? And then finally, Canada's involvement in the last moment, which is judicial constitutionalism and the development of human rights jurisprudence. I have a lot of cases that do the following four things. One, I'll just finish in half a minute. We have litigants who are Canadian, which make it necessary for courts, for example, in adoption cases, to decide with a Canadian law lens with regards to their the status of adopted children from Kenya. The other one is cases that increasingly cite Canadian authorities, and that is happening a lot. The third thing is Canadian contribution to the training of judges. That is also happening a lot. The fourth is litigation involving Canadian interests that is taking place in Kenya, and that has a bearing on human rights. Thank you so much, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Sylvia. The next speaker is Ms. Juliana Gabagambi. I've been told to pronounce it properly. Did I get it now? Yes. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Prof has said she has changed the gear. I don't know what gear should I use so that I can finish quickly so that you have time to go and dance. So my title is Canadian Tanzanian Human Rights Engagement and a critical assessment of literature, but as other presenters, I couldn't find a lot of literature on this aspect. So I'll just discuss the history and current trends and Canada engagements. So Tanzania was under British and the Germans, and during those times, human rights were not practiced. But thereafter, when we got independence, Mwalimu Nyerere did not accept the Bill of Rights to be incorporated in the Constitution. The reason being that if they did not practice human rights, why are they forcing us to practice human rights? I think it was a good reason. And also there was an issue of nationalization, because they couldn't allow people to own properties. So he said they could not incorporate the Bill of Rights in the Constitution. But what are the current trends in Tanzania? There's an issue of the right to life. It is a constitutional right, but we have people with albinism. They are being killed, and then we are saying these murderers should not be killed. So we have a conflict. How can we resolve this? Should we just let them go, or they should be hanged to death? I'd like to learn from you, and that's why yesterday I was asking TD and the guy from Botswana as to why did they retain and others they abolished. Then we have rights of minorities, and on this one I picked the gays and lesbians. In Tanzania currently we're not allowed to speak about gays and lesbians' rights. And the Minister for Justice and Constitutional Affairs, it was last month, he said, anyone who will be discussing about rights of gays and lesbians will face consequences. So people are afraid to talk about it. But I was asking myself, is it a cultural thing, or why are they saying we should not discuss it? And maybe I would like also to learn from Prof. Bauer? Yes. Is it a cultural thing, or what is it? Because I read an article, it's a medical article, but they said gays have been in Tanzania even before the coming of colonialism. So why are we still saying it's a cultural thing? And then the rights of women. In Tanzania, currently rights of women are protected. They can own properties, they can sell properties. But I was asking myself, is it time also to discuss about men's rights? Or it's not the time? Because like we have the Love Marriage Act, it says a man has a duty to take care of the family, but a woman can have that duty when the man is sick. And then talking about equality, do we think it's time that women also have the same role as men so that we can all be equal, or it just remains like that? So what has Canada been doing in Tanzania? Canada has been doing a lot in Tanzania, especially in education, health, and also on issues of women and children. As with education, they are funding projects on improving the quality of education, because the quality of education went off track, especially after Nyerere's administration. So they are trying to train teachers and also provide materials for constructing classes so that students can get quality education. And also they are providing health facilities and training health officials so that children don't die at early age. And there's issue of registration of children. It was difficult in Tanzania to get a birth certificate, but currently Canada is funding projects on that area, and parents can get birth certificates within the ward. They don't have to travel or pay any amount of money to get birth certificates. And also Canada is funding projects to end forced marriages and the violence against children. So those are the areas that I thought I should discuss. Thank you.
I'm not sure, Professor Faisal Baha. I'm not sure how you, Baba. I'm not sure how you guys are doing it. You guys are doing it together. Yeah, you can split the time yourself, right?
Yeah, we'll
Okay.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation. I just wanted to point out that, that's fine. Okay, just leave it like that. Oh, it's not for I just want to clarify, we're very happy to be on the panel on Kenya and Tanzania. I think there may have been a slight miscommunication on my part. I do have research on Kenya, but this research is collaborative with Christina, who spent time in Ghana, and so our frame is actually, I think we could say general Africa in general, but our focus really, and the themes are more of a theoretical than a case study, but the examples that we do draw from are from the West African context rather than the East African context, just to clarify at the outset. So Christina's going to present elements of our paper, and then I will present some additional elements, and we'll try to manage our time effectively.
We haven't had like a
Dress
rehearsal, yeah, so this is going to be on the fly.
So
Okay.
The mic is for recording purposes.
Okay,
only, so don't
that's
worry about
great.
amplifying.
First of all, thank you, Professor Baba, for allowing me this opportunity, and Professor Okafor for having us here today. Secondly, I guess I'm going to start off by contextualizing how the idea for this paper came up. So I was part of the ILP program last summer in 2015. I went to Ghana for 3 months. I worked with Defense for Children International there. And, you know, I observed and experienced quite a lot that I hadn't experienced before. And a couple of problems sort of bubbled up during my time when I was working there. So to give you an idea, the sorts of things that I was doing was, you know, advocacy in children's schools. So I'd be traveling to different schools in Ghana, talking to children about what does, you know, gendered violence mean, and all sorts of interesting endeavors like that. As well as helping DCI draft their own policies. So while I was doing this, 2 things came up which are directly relevant to our paper. One was I started becoming sort of skeptical by this bad feeling I would get when I would go into schools and try to teach little Ghanaian girls and boys about what their rights were. I felt like in a way I was telling them how to live their lives, or telling them how they should look at their parents and things like that. So I felt a little bit like an outsider and an intruder. And the second thing that came up was, well, I noticed that there were big gaps sort of between the policies that I was learning and helping DCI with and the actual implementation on the ground. So I thought, okay, is it even worthwhile? Like, why are we doing this project when there doesn't seem to be real differences? And finally, I have a personal interest in prison reform or in penal theories. It's part of what I'm doing my JD and MA in philosophy for. And as Professor Baba and I discussed earlier, children are probably the most vulnerable group of all if we're talking about prison populations, which are globally very, very vulnerable people. So this is kind of where the drive to do this work came from. So the overview. Our main point really is that more law does not mean greater justice, and in this case does not mean greater justice for imprisoned children. This is something that I've come to learn since coming to law school. More law is not necessarily a good thing. So I'm gonna quickly try to situate the context in which we're talking. Then I'm gonna talk a little bit about the ethical framework. And there are 3 broad critiques of international human rights law. But I'm going to mainly focus on one and just flag the other 2 in the interest of time and to give Professor Baba some airtime. Okay. So To start with, the CRC is probably one of the most successful legal tools that we've seen on a global scale. All of the countries in the world, as you can see by that map, that's the ratification map, and the red is the countries that have not yet ratified, and it's only the United States left now. Sudan ratified earlier this year. So, you know, the sorts of things the CRC does is provide special treatment when children come into conflict with the law. This is obviously just one small bit of it, but it's the part that I'm focused on today. In many countries, the creation of separate juvenile justice laws and institutions were justified by drawing on the recommendations of the CRC. So the push for law reform can contribute to accomplishing many goals, but as mentioned, more law does not always mean more justice. The growth of children's rights movement in Africa in the 90s provides a valuable case study to illuminate how juvenile justice has operated on the continent since the adoption of relevant international human rights standards. It can also provide a lens for evaluating the ways in which international children's rights movement has helped or failed African children engaged in the criminal justice system. Now, there's also another act called the African Charter on Children's Rights. Okay, I have to actually read it because it's long. African Charter on Rights and Welfare of the Child. So the ACRWC, which actually was enacted only a year after the CRC, and is actually quite different from the CRC, but has seen less success with being ratified. And I think I should mention that I couldn't find a perfect map, but the red are the countries that have not yet ratified. So almost everyone, but not quite. It hasn't been as widely implemented, which I found interesting, because you'd think that the African Charter would, you know, on the rights of a child would be adopted even more so in the African nations, but that hasn't been the case. So we're gonna flag that a little bit later on. So one, you know, we've gotta situate the problem in like the realities. What do the numbers actually look like? How many children are actually imprisoned? And so on. And one method of doing this is to look at the statistical information that's available. I should mention these numbers are from 2008, so they're not 100% perfectly accurate. But as I get to at the end, these are vastly inaccurate statistics anyways, so we can't take them that seriously. And the reason that they're vastly inaccurate is because there's an absence of birth certificates, as it was recently mentioned in a presentation. I'm not sure which you meant. Oh, there you are. Yeah. As you mentioned in Tanzania, like that's an issue with birth certificates. Then there's police coercion of those under 18 to lie about their age and report. So this is all happening when children are being arrested and brought into the prison system and put into jail cells with adults. So at this moment where the child is being brought to the police station and being put into the population, you know, they don't have the birth certificate, so they don't know how old they are. Then often the police will like force them to say, well, just say you're 18, you look like you're tall, you know, and in you go with the regular prison population. Then there's also a lack of an organized system to account for prisoners more generally. And finally, there's reliance on media reports and NGOs to physically account for imprisoned children, which I don't know if that's necessarily the best method of doing it, right? You want like a really legitimate state-enforced way of accounting for how many children there actually are and where they are. So it's worth noting that while many, if not most, children in Africa who end up in prison arrive there as a result of a legal process, usually a criminal prosecution, there are also reports of street children being picked up off the streets, intimidated, and beaten by police officers, and sometimes, you know, put in jail cells among the adult population, as I mentioned. Reports like this were brought to my attention when I was in Ghana. This was a special conference held for educators in Ghana, where it was brought to their attention that, look, don't tell children to necessarily go up to police officers and feel confident about doing so, because often they're just very intimidated and scared because, you know, word on the street is police are bad people. So, you know, clearly the problem is social, it's economic, it's political, it's much larger than just one thing. So here we argue that the literature contains good cause to be skeptical about legislative efforts seeking to promote the juvenile systems of sub-Saharan Africa. We argue that the children's rights movement, like any normative legal movement, can actually fail the persons or groups that it intends to help. Okay, so there's some critiques of international human rights law. Now, this is going a little bit broad. I know I'm doing a little bit of like, zooming in on children in prison, and now I'm going back out again. So we want to look at developing an ethical framework for how to analyze juvenile justice systems as they've developed out of this movement in sub-Saharan Africa. So developing an ethical framework like this requires a healthy amount of critical reflection. And I have here Makau Mutua's quote from Savages, Victims, and Saviors, which is that the globalization of human rights fits a historical pattern in which all high morality comes from the West as a civilizing agent against lower forms of civilization in the rest of the world. In the early 2000s, there was a proliferation of skeptical scholarship, including third world approaches to international law, or better known as TWAIL, which offer, sobering critiques of globalization generally and the globalization of human rights through international law specifically. Now, for our purposes here, we've focused mainly on David Kennedy's work. He's our main guide. He examines the growth of international campaigns to protect refugees, promote economic development, regulate the conduct of war, and promote human rights, including children's rights. He has a checklist of sort of 10 things that any human rights lawyer, any self-respecting human rights lawyer should look at and check their work against to ensure that they're actually being ethical in their approaches to solving problems in different countries. So he produces an inventory of unforeseen consequences, blind spots, and biases of humanitarian work. So what we have done here is we've summarized his work, and yeah, I can go to this now. So we've summarized his work into 3 broad categories. We've taken those very, well thought out 10 points and sort of crunched them into broader areas that we can quickly present about. And one of them is the implicit political nature of international human rights law, the exclusion of distributional justice in international human rights law, and the problematic discourse of international human rights law. In what follows, we provide a brief explanation for grouping Kennedy's inventory items together under these categories and apply these critiques to the children's rights movement, the development of domesticated juvenile justice reforms, and some of the legal instruments pertaining to the detainment of children within the African context. And I know what you're thinking, this sounds like so much, but I'll keep it very brief. So, these 3 things, they're not standalone critiques. Each is a thread in the web of problems identified from the international human rights movement. They each pull on each other in different ways. So I'm going to spend some time talking about the implicit political nature of international human rights law. This encompasses 4 of Kennedy's critiques, but they really all distill to this idea that international human rights law, despite its universal and supposedly objective, apolitical, colorless application and implementation, is in fact political on a professional level, on a personal level, but also, and importantly, at the state level. Entrenching international human rights acts has political consequences for countries that take on this Western philosophy. Now, here we focus on Kennedy's concern beyond the simple objection that human rights discourse is rooted in a Western-dominated normativity and priorities, which is what Mutua's quote sort of talked about. Instead, we're focusing on a specific critique with practical implications. That is the accusation that human rights reflect cultural biases rooted in the anxieties and priorities that emerge from the West's own troubled history. This translates into a human rights that is primarily individualistic and secular, strangely detached from the way many people live their lives and pluralist conceptions of the good life. It is viewed as inadequate for neglecting the role of spirituality in the human rights project and ignores the marginalization of community, group identity, and creativity, all while pretending to be objective and universal. So, one way in which this critique is relevant to the children's rights movement in Africa is evidenced by the divergent philosophies underpinning the CRC and the ACRWC. So in practicality, both treaties emphasize the importance of best interests of the child, which is a highly individualistic standard that means different things to different people in different communities. But aside from this, my sweater decided to come out. But aside from this, the conventions could not be any more different in spirit, reflecting entirely different conceptions of the social contract. This is what the philosophy background does. You go back to the social contract. So what do I mean by this? I mean, the Western approach to the social contract has been articulated anywhere from Hobbes to Rawls, and refers mainly to the obligations of rational adults, which is almost always adults. In African cultures and normative philosophies, however, the child has both rights and great obligations towards parents, towards the community, and is raised with an awareness of these obligations. Tuom Danso discusses the presumed allegations of the child in the Ghanaian context. She says, children have the right to be obedient, they have the right to respect parents and all elderly people in the community, and they have the responsibility to respect elders and do what is right. So there's this awareness in the African tradition that it's a trade-off, like your parents will take care of you, but you need to take care of your parents when they're older, and there's always this idea of very great respect for your elders, which doesn't really happen. Like, it would be bizarre for Western children to have that exact same mentality, because here we're a culture dominated by pluralistic individualism. So it's just I would say fundamentally they're different at the core, these two acts. So now that the ACRWC then, it more likely reflects a more accurate picture of the aggregate or consensus of African belief and value systems, which begs the question, why is it that more African states have adopted the CRC? In fact, all of them have, rather than the African Charter. So we think that at least part of that answer lies in the implicit political nature of international human rights law. So first of all, the ratification, there's two kind of main points I have there. Ratification as a political decision itself. And what I mean by that is that the ratification itself, it can be seen and is seen as a political decision. I didn't mention this earlier, but maybe I should have. The perception of modernizing or developing a country by aligning with a Western orientation may be viewed as a positive move that will garner respect in the international community and open the door to economic and political cooperation. The international perception matters to all leaders. However, it might matter in particular ways to the leaders of African states that are trying to secure legitimacy, stability, and prosperity. If international perception and evaluation is what motivates ratification, there's no reason to reject ratification out of hand, and that's not really what we're trying to do anyway. But it's a good reason to begin with skepticism and to evaluate pragmatically the utility of the move. It may very well be that some positive practical consequences flow from ratification of international instruments like this. A second way of viewing the ratification is looking at the political consequences that stem from ratifying an act like the CRC or the ACRWC. For instance, Ghana has entrenched the relevant articles of the CRC, which are Article 37 and Article 40, which speak directly to how countries should govern juvenile justice. And they've done this in 2003 in the Juvenile Justice Act. The problem is that the top-down approach to justice is seldom successful, particularly when the general population are not aware of what norms these new laws will import. So in a study by Manful and Manful in 2014 in Ghana, the authors found that there's great disparity between legislators' view of the CRC and or children's rights and experience of children's rights, as well as child caregivers' rights. So this study particularly looked at child caregivers and what they thought child's rights meant, and they looked at the legislators' view. And there was actually found confusion and skepticism at both levels. So I'll tell you what their findings were. So, yeah, how are we doing for time? Oh, good God, that's not good. Okay. Oh, that's too bad. I was just getting to the really good stuff. Okay, well, I'll just very quickly wrap up then with what the study found. The study found that the caregivers were very skeptical and dismissive of the CRC, and they were found to vastly misunderstand its purpose. They believed that it meant child participation and autonomy. So a caregiver said, children's rights, allowing children to be involved in every issue is a white man's idea. It has nothing to do with us. But that's not, of course, what children's rights really means. We don't need children to be involved in every idea, but there's this great kind of confusion. And the legislators themselves also expressed some skepticism, claiming Ghana wants to be seen by the whole world that it is doing well. So when it comes to signing conventions, we sign, so that we would be in the good books of the international community. So I'll leave you sort of with that. We do have a solution that we proposed to this,
let's
but
save
we
it
can
for
save
discussion.
it.
I want to add just one point, and a very brief point, because Christina's covered really the bulk of our paper, and I encourage you to read it if you're interested in anything that you hear, and we welcome feedback and comments, especially from subject area or region area experts, which neither of us is. But if I could bring it home to Canada and make just one point and suggest that this skeptical approach to states and the way they play politics with international human rights may not be just an African phenomenon, and we certainly aren't suggesting that. In fact, if you go back to September 2012, when the Canadian government was up for review on its implementation at the United Nations Committee on the Rights of the Child, this was a 10-year review, so it won't happen again, I guess, for another 10 years. 4 years ago, the report chastised Canada for its approach, in particular to youth criminal justice, describing what was then new legislation as, quote, excessively punitive for children and not sufficiently restorative in nature. It went on to criticize social programs that Canada, or the lack of social programs that Canada offers for children in poverty, specifically what it called, quote, serious and widespread discrimination against the poor, Aboriginal children, visible minorities, immigrants, and children with disabilities. So the most vulnerable of children being the most vulnerable of the population, and then the most vulnerable of the children being abandoned by the government of this country. Ironically, that same week that Canada was being condemned at the UN, Prime Minister Stephen Harper, our former Prime Minister, was avoiding the UN, obviously, but he was in New York attending an organization called the Appeal of Conscience Foundation, a right-wing Christian think tank activist organization that had named Stephen Harper World Statesman of the Year. So we had, in the very same week in New York City at the UN headquarters, one very strong statement about Canada's respect for children's rights, and in a different setting, a very different kind of statement being made about Canada's respect for international human rights. So with that, thank you for your time.
Yeah.
We look forward to comments and discussion.
Thank you very much. So I think it's time to invite the two discussants. I'm not sure how you guys want to do it. Maxwell Miyawa, do you want to come up front? It's up to you. Whichever, or you want us to bring, yeah? Yeah.
I think the first presenter, Sylvia, who comes from my country, thank you so much for that great presentation, which illuminates the various levels and areas of engagement between Canada and Kenya. One thing that I noted is that there seems to be quite a high level of engagement between Canada and Kenya compared to what every other presenter has given us. And the question that I ask myself is why? Why this high level of engagement in both political, social, and even economic? Because you're saying that there are certain areas where Canada is supporting groups on how on empowerment of youth groups, the marginalized community. So I think in terms of that level of engagement, the one thing that needs to be answered is why this high level of engagement? Because if you look at the paper, it gives actually in monetary terms the amount of money that Canada is pouring in these various sectors, and it's quite huge an amount of money compared to other presentations in other countries. So I think a question needs to be addressed: why this high level of engagement? The other thing, of course, another issue which has always raised a concern in our country is the fact of Western government support for civil society and NGOs, which raises legitimacy questions. Remember, our president was held before the International Criminal Court at a time when he was still in office. So, and then that created some bad blood between the international community and our country and the government. So immediately took over power. He started, zeroing in on some NGOs and civil society movements, and coming up with some domestic law of licensing and certain procedures. But to me, I think a question needs to be asked: the questions of legitimacy when a foreign government supports civil society movement and organizations in other countries. For example, there have been questions of foreign government supporting reforms within the judicial institutions. That happened most recently. And because our High Court has demonstrated a great deal of movements towards human rights and various reforms. So the question that was asked at one point was the fact that, if civil society movements are supporting the judiciary and foreign governments are supporting the judiciary, when cases are being are coming before the judiciary, then there is bound to be areas of legitimacy in terms of the judgment that can come out of those the courts, which are supported by certain sectors. The other element of judicial cross-pollination, which I noted because I served at the Supreme Court before I came here, is a sort of inclination to jurisprudence coming particularly from Canada and South Africa. Long before we had a lot of cases or reliance on cases from the UK, but I see a trend of that disinclination to borrow from the UK and now to move to other areas like Canada. But there's a problem, there's a danger. We know that, for instance, we may share certain similarities and commonalities in terms of the Bill of Rights. But the problem that arises for our judiciary is that there is some sort of uncritical reflection of some of those judicial decisions. For example, one of the questions that we found at the Supreme Court is the fact that treatment of questions of fact in this country, an appellate court should treat matters of fact with some level of deference. But in our constitutional standard, questions of fact, especially in election matters, those are constitutional questions. So that when they go before the Supreme Court should engage with facts. But we adopted whole cloth the judicial test laid by the Supreme Court of Canada, which says on matters of fact, an appellate court cannot engage. But when that becomes when it's a constitutional issue, then there is a command on the court to engage with the questions of fact. The other thing about Kenya is in terms of Kenya has recently discovered oil, and so is Tanzania. I think one level of engagement that needs to be interrogated is how conflicts associated with resource rent that has plagued various countries, Nigeria, the DRC. How can we learn from Canada, so that we do not experience that level of conflict that other societies, other countries have experienced? I think there's something that we can learn, and this kind of engagement can tell us something, how to manage conflicts that always arise as a result of extractive industries and local communities and so forth. So to the last presenter, the only thing that I can say is that to the dwellers, there is something positive about Western or human rights having that Western orientation or Western heritage. For example, human rights, though they have got Western, they have got rootage in Western tradition, but there's something profoundly positive about it. For example, empowering communities, giving human beings dignity. The idea of the fact that human rights make human beings realize their full potential. So Western orientation, notwithstanding, human rights have got some potentialities. in terms of challenging the coercive power of the state. So I think that needs to be looked into. Any other thing I think I will ask in the question session. So I think that is my intervention. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Maxwell. Jakes Okechukwefodu, you're next on.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to also just add a few comments on the three great papers we just went through. I would start with the last, because I really like the title actually, Who Will Remember the Children? Sounds like a movie. You can make something out of it. And then today is International Human Rights Day as well. I just thought to mention. I really like the paper. I think it's very relevant not only for people who are interested in children's rights, but also like human rights in general, because you underscore quite a number of key issues that govern international human rights law in total, especially the political angle, and problematizing it with the discourse around the theories that have emerged in this particular area. So I'll just touch on 5 things that I think are very striking. One is, the assertion that more law does not mean more justice. And I think this is very, very important, especially for human rights issues back home, to let people understand that even though you're victims of human rights abuses, that the fact that there's a law that promotes or protects you does not mean that there will be justice as well. I thought that was brilliantly stated in this paper. And then I like when you address the issue of child labor, because some of us who grew back home actually had to sell stuff to go through school, but it didn't mean that we lost on the best things from life. Like, we went to school, but we also sold stuff and we also, made money. And where I'm from Anambra State in Nigeria, for example, you have a lot of boys go to learn businesses while girls go to school. So you have a lot of Federal Government Girls College, Federal Government Girls College on Federal Government Girls College, this and the rest of that. But also the process of learning a trade is also like a form of education. I like how you use Kennedy's criticism of socioeconomic inequality to see that whilst Africa has a lot of, children population, the negotiation for a lighter workload, smaller school hours was just states on the point, because you have a lot of academics saying prohibit child labor. You even have a lot of African human rights activists who are saying we don't want child labor, without also addressing how can we negotiate and have a win-win situation with it. So I thought that point was excellent on children's rights and economic justice. Then on the obligations and stakeholders, I found that very interesting, because when it comes to children's rights, there are tons of stakeholders here. You have the parents, you have the community, you have the caregivers, you have the legislators, and a couple of other people. So it's quite broad. And the distinction between the pluralistic individualism versus the Ghanaian context, I like that. I also find that there's actually a link between the Juvenile Justice Act of 2003 and the Youth Juvenile Justice Act of Canada. I think there was some relationship between that. So talking about engagement, maybe we can tie the similarities between the two and how Ghana and Canada has engaged in this particular area. The doctrine of the best interest of the child is something that it has tons and tons of, of literature around that, but I like how you justify it here. It makes very, 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 very good sense. And then the 5th point is casting the doubt on the definition of success implicit on, law reform institutions. The fact that legislative action has promoted the CRC, for example, does not necessarily mean that the state is really interested in the rights of children. Neither does it mean that the stakeholders and the caregivers understand these rights and can even work with them. So you see, that's a very big problem you've actually addressed in this paper, because you've shown that even though these rights have been, they've ratified these laws, the people who are meant to use them are not using them, and why are they not using them? So I think the focus for activists is not necessarily saying, okay, these laws now applicable to us, but also, are they being used and how well so far? Finally, I'm just tempted to, because this paper is I read it like 2-3 times, and I could relate with it regarding a couple of the things that emerged today with children's rights across the world. I don't know if you know about the baby Gami case. I'll just give you a little bit of information. Australian commissioning parents went to Thailand and they got a surrogate to have a baby for them. So the surrogate was pregnant with twins, and 7 months through the pregnancy, they discovered that because a boy and a girl, that the boy had Down syndrome. So there were conversations around, maybe they should abort the male child and keep the female one. And the surrogate said she wanted to keep the male child, even though he had Down syndrome, because of her culture and tradition. So it sparked a lot of controversy around, what does international law say about the rights of, children who are gotten through surrogacy? And I know there was a huge, big, support internationally for the child, for baby Gami, that's the boy child. And a couple of friends of mine actually took a case to the, I think, the ICCPR committee or something, which is quite odd because maybe they'll go to the CRC committee or whatever, but I mean, they didn't get any recourse at that level. But it also just opens a new ground regarding what does international law say about children who come from surrogacy. And I think Canada is quite advanced in this area because I don't know if I'm barely a month here, but I know that in Canada, you can't, surrogacy, for example, you can't pay for it. It has to be like you're doing it for free or something like that. And that also outlays to the
Can I ask, it also raises the question of gender selection, genetic selection of children, which is also an issue. I think I saw something in today's newspaper on
that. So I think
discrimination in decisions around
abortion and that. So I like to see how far and wide international human rights law can go for children, and especially how children come about. Okay. Sorry, I spent too much time on it because it was a really nice one. But thanks for that, it was great. On the second presentation, I really, really liked it because it, first of all, gave us a good background on Tanzania by giving us the historical antecedents of these rights and the challenges faced by women, other minorities, as well as even people living with albinism. I'm talking about the engagement with Canada and Tanzania. I find that they actually both have, you see, the issues are very different. For Canada, the issues with people living with albinism has always been skin challenges, or skincare challenges, or vision challenges, but back home, it's like these people are being killed. You see, it's the same problem with, let's say, gay rights here is about, we want to get married, we want to have children, or we want to walk on the street and be equal. Back home is they actually are going to die, or they'll be imprisoned. But I liked how you also give the academic, you call the academics he, and that's also reflective on the paper by showing that actually women have not really gotten a fair share of their rights in Tanzania. So thanks for that. The final paper, I'm trying to rush, is the one from Kenya. And I think Maxwell has already, one of the issues that actually, because when he said Canada just keeps pouring money, I'm like, there's tons of, Canada has money. When you look through this conference, I just see millions here, millions there in Canada, in Kenya, in Nigeria. I'm like, what? So much money. And I'm trying to find out, what is the reasoning behind it, and do we even address why this huge amount, millions and millions of dollars, almost like someone is actually tempted to steal the money, like you see the case of the 2 million. It's so huge, But also, I'm also thinking we also need to create a mechanism where we, as recipients of these monies, must also account if these statistics actually, did we really receive these amounts of money, and where did they really go? Sorry, I'll just finish in a bit. I wanted to just a few things. The paper was really, really rich, especially as, I think from all the papers we've seen here so far, this one really showed a really strong engagement between Canada and Kenya on so many grounds: voters' education, corruption as a human rights issue, food security, access to primary health care, vulnerable girls and children, people with everything, business and human rights, and the way Canada engages with Kenya on different fronts, from social activities to even cases before the court. One very striking thing I find is Canada has almost the most progressive laws for intersex children, babies who are either not XX or XY. I think 1 in 1,666 child is either not XX or XY. And we find that in Kenya, a very progressive case, adopted the Canadian research, if I can use that word, in this particular area, and they succeeded. And it didn't just start by, we're going to sample what Canada did in this particular area. From the paper, it showed that there had been on so many engagements on different levels with the NGOs, for example, on women's rights, on maternal health care, and then straight into the courts, and then they got success. Such that you can even find Canadians litigating in Kenya on the mining issues. So I think the reason why Kenya has so much, or why this paper has actually addressed so much, is because there have been successes on different grounds, on different fronts, and maybe we can learn from that. I also like the tie between civil and political rights and socioeconomic rights with voter education, in the sense that the justification that, CPR is more important than ESR, when if people don't understand who their leaders are or what the political system is made up of, they would not, obviously have, that particular right to vote. I just wanted to raise a few things about the use of the role of juniors and majors. When you talk about the due diligence in oil and gas, if you could throw a bit more light on that, that would have been awesome. And I like how you portrayed the Western power. Actually, you see, from what I'm seeing from the paper, Canada is not the actor. They seem to influence all the actors here. They're in everywhere: politics, human rights, oil and gas, women, children's rights, even in the courtrooms. So I like that engagement. Maybe we can actually expand on that. Is that a strategy, not to be directly visible? I know you also showed that Canada did not colonize Africa. So is that the reason why they're not really directly forceful, but they are putting so much money on the ground? Then a lot of questions around why. Again, even with the visa issue, which you just touched on very briefly, why do they give you guys 5-10 years and they give Nigeria like 2-3 months? And also, why the money? But I also like how these three papers sort of actually connect one another in one way or the other. When we talk about the rights of children in Ghana and their right to socioeconomic justice, as it relates with children living with albinism in Tanzania, and then the intersex children in Kenya, yesterday I was saying Canada wants to be the bastion of women's rights globally, but today I can say actually they also want to be the children's rights leaders in the world. So thanks for the great presentation, and I hope everyone has learned from this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jakes. I guess we will open the floor now for questions. Okay. You have the microphone, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So I think this question is for Professor Baba and, sorry, I can't remember. Kristen, hi. Do you remember me, Professor Baba?
I know you're an expert on this, and I'm not.
So, yeah. So, yeah.
I remember what's important.
Yeah. So, of course, I will ask the obvious questions. Because I think, I like that you started, David Kennedy, the critique of rights. So I thought you were going to go with the classic kind of critical legal studies approach, because I was thinking, because I feel like there's this thing that I still read from the, well, not, I haven't read the paper in details, but even from the presentation, that there's this expectation that just because maybe Ghana or whichever country has ratified or signed the law, we think that, this kind of legal process approach, that there is a determinant, you sign the right, or maybe even you domesticate it, therefore because we have it, and then it will translate to maybe this kind of reform on, I think where I'm going is, we always have to, and I think Professor Kafo mentioned it this morning, we always have to look at the politics. Yeah, you did identify some of the politics, why they signed it, maybe because they want to get some legitimacy internationally. But the thing is, even beyond that, suppose even if they had signed it on the basis of some kind of altruistic, and they had this grand notion of doing it, what is the political economy? What are the issues around it for them to implement these things that they are signing? And I think that is the crux of the issue. I find they may sign it for whatever intentions, but I'm even positing that even if they signed it with this very good motive, there are limitations to the practical implementation of the things that they are signing. And I think for me, that's where the crux of the issue, because if you tease out that, then it's beyond just the critique of law, because really, maybe my own personal position is the law can only do so much. And I'm very critical of expectations that, even if the law is there on paper and we sign it with these good intentions, when I get back home, can I implement the law? And I think those are the issues, that we need to be talking about. Yeah.
So, of course,
we
we
just-
cited your important work in our paper. We wouldn't have neglected to do that. Do we respond
No,
immediately?
we'll just take a couple of few more questions then, so you get a chance to kind of like respond to all of them. All right, Halima.
My question is for Professor Sylvia. I noticed that her research, the paper was very good, very rich indeed, compared to other papers that have been presented, especially on areas of engagement, human rights engagements of Canada and most of the African countries. I don't know, maybe, can she tell us, maybe she used a different method of research or something? Or why is Canada doing so much?
She's from Kenya.
Yes, please, I would like to know if she used some other methods of research. Thank you.
Okay, we'll take one more. Moses, I know Moses raised his hand. So we'll just take the first three from Moses, then get the speakers to respond, then we'll take more questions.
Thank you very much, Professor Baba and Christina. Very interesting paper touching on children's rights indeed. I enjoyed the presentation. Just minor questions. When I first looked at the title, I thought that, wow, it's a very broad topic. Is it covering the whole of Africa? Juvenile justice in Africa as a whole? But as you went along, then you focused on Uganda. But what I did not get clear, there were instances where you kept referring at the African culture, African tradition. Was that country specific? Was it the Ghanaian culture or the African culture as a whole? Perhaps a clarity there might assist me. Then secondly, there was also a general statement regarding the imprisonment of children in Africa as opposed to Ghana specifically. So I thought the clarity also there will assist me. Then arriving at the figures regarding the children who have been imprisoned, I'm just curious on the methodology. Which people were interviewed there? Did you guys go to the prison facilities and try maybe to find out how many children in order to arrive at those percentages? Then the last point, I don't know how you had phrased it, but it's something along that more laws do not translate to justice, in my own words. I'm not sure, because if you want to vindicate the rights, there must be a particular document that clearly spells out what is it that you require in order to ensure that those rights are realized. It might be either law or policy. So if you don't have that, I'm wondering, how will you vindicate them otherwise? Thank you.
Okay, yeah, so we can start from the other presentation and just get people to respond. Professor Sylvia, please. Yes.
Thanks for the question, Halima, regarding what research methods I used. To be honest, when I started working on this, I got very nervous. I wasn't finding anything, no books, no articles, a few resources online. But I guess it's also what was I looking for. When I decided that there's nothing I will find that tells a good straight story about this, I had now to start piecing things together, looking at NGOs, because I knew if there was money coming for human rights, the NGO community is very active. Have they done reports? Have they been supported by Canadians in any way, and so on and so forth. So I was privileged, maybe because I'm Dean, I got a research assistant to help me out. And that really moved things along. But as I noted, I wasn't going to present anything sophisticated about it, just the facts as you see them in the paper, and then maybe now we can work on a theoretical framework, which is also partly some of what I was trying to do. So on the part of the theoretical framework, there's nothing that I could find that directly linked Kenyan and Canadian engagement. But on tracing the money, it's easier to find if you do that. And the money is in NGOs, in government, in Canadian websites, and so on. Now, related to that is why there's more engagement in Kenya. I don't know. Maybe the Canadian High Commissioner in Kenya is more active or more visible because of the geopolitics, or more organized. It could just come down to personal management strategies that each High Commissioner might have that the next door one might not have, and so on. It's also about politics, right? So it could be that, but also the location. UNEP, I mentioned, is headquartered in Nairobi. Nairobi is a corridor for a lot of good and bad things. So it tends to attract attention in that sense.
What of the game reserves?
All right, Mr. Baba, I guess you guys can. I'm not sure. Yes. Do you let me get a question? I think you got a question.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So, Ope, your question, I think, is one that you make a point that we agree with, which is that implementation is the tough part. Getting rights on paper is one step, and certainly there's politics in that, and certainly there's politics in implementation as well. But it's a different set of political questions. It's more of a domestic process, and I think that we agree. The statement that more law doesn't mean more justice ties in to answer that question. It ties in to answer the other question as well, which is that we see law as a beginning, but not necessarily an end. And what we take from the critical theories is sometimes it can be a beginning that sets you back rather than forward, because and maybe this can. I'm bleeding now into answering the question about, don't you need law to advance rights? You need a structure. But structure, and the answer is yes, but structure for Kennedy can also be constricting and constraining and corrupting. If your conception of the child is in the shape of a circle and you create a box for children's rights, you could be cutting off aspects of the conception of the child. Where does the conception of the child come from? It comes from culture. What is culture? Well, that's a fraught question. I'm not going to answer that question for you. What do we mean when we say culture? Well, I think we're meaning lots of different things at various points in the paper. So, or we may be imprecise in our use of the term culture, and I think that partly reduces to the fact that culture itself is a culturally embedded concept and is a difficult concept to agree on. So do we say African culture in the paper? Do we use that phrase? Possibly. And is that a problematic or an unclear phrase? It can be. Can we not talk about culture at all when talking about human rights? No. What the critical scholars say is when you talk about human rights, what you actually mean is Western culture. Is there such thing as a Western culture? I don't know. I think if you ask everybody in this room about what Western culture means to them, we'll get as many different opinions as there are people. So I take the point that talking about culture gets tricky, and we have to avoid reductionism and essentialism. This paper was a broad literature review, primarily. We did not do any primary research. We did not do empirical evidence gathering. We had the benefit that both of us have spent time in Africa. One of us has spent time observing prisons in Ghana and working closely with advocates who work on juvenile justice in the prison system in Ghana. We drew from some of that experiential and anecdotal insight to shape some of our positions and some of our assumptions and the research directions. But we do not pretend that this paper is offering an empirical contribution to the literature. What I'm hearing from Sylvia is something that we also experience, which is a lack of data. And I think that this symposium, if anything, should be creating an impetus for doubling down on and looking for research and encouraging research, empirical research on these questions. So what we did is we flagged areas of empirical gaps. How can you have a high standard of children's rights protection on the one hand in law, and yet a complete hole in who the population is that you're working to improve the condition of, and the lack of evidence of numbers on how many children in any number of West African countries or African countries that we looked at, any selection. It's not a rigorous methodology. We basically got some stats from random countries that we could identify. This is not a thorough project of empirical research. But I think we've got enough to be able to say with confidence that there are gaps between adoption and implementation, and we agree with the experts that have identified that it's that gap that is the problem. And we want to explore theories for greater implementation. And part of exploring the alternative charter, the African charter that is, the less well-known charter, is to look for space to negotiate implementation. And we do think that rights, perhaps at the level of writing them, is a matter of persuasion and legal advocacy, political advocacy. But at the level of implementation, it's more a process of socializing, of acculturation, and there's literature that looks into this. And our next step in this paper is to look at some of the socialization theory, which comes with its own set of critiques as well. But we certainly want to focus the remaining work on this paper on trying to answer some of the questions around implementation. Do you want to add anything to that?
Okay. I'll take Marcel, Professor Kober, Iri, I know Cynthia has something, and Sylvia.
Okay, so my question is for Jelena, mostly out of curiosity than anything else. So you say that Tanzania was colonized by British and the Germans, right? And during this period of colonization, human rights wasn't practiced. But then after independence, Nyerere said he wasn't going to practice human rights. And I wondered why, because it's like saying because the British and the German, they treated us badly, that's justification for the bad treatment to continue from our own people. So I just wanted to know, has anything changed? Are you still operating under this philosophy that because they treated us badly, then that treatment has to continue?
Okay, I'll go to. No, you hold on. You respond afterwards.
Thank you, moderator. I have a number of comments for the speakers as well as the commentators. But maybe I should actually start with the last question that was asked. At the dawn of independence, two countries in particular in the Commonwealth side of Africa did not like the idea of a constitutional Bill of Rights. First was Kwame Nkrumah's Ghana, and also subsequently Nyerere's Tanzania. And the reason for that was because they felt that Bill of Rights would limit the policy-making capacity of the government at this time when Nkrumah and Nyerere thought that they needed a lot of flexibility in order to deal with the issues that they had to cope with at that time. But if you look at it closely, it didn't have as much effect in Tanzania in terms of bad human rights record as it did in Ghana, where there was preventive detention almost immediately, and the leader of the opposition actually, I think, died in prison under Kwame Nkrumah. But we didn't see that at all in the benevolent leadership of Nyerere on the other side of the continent. Well, my first comment has to do with the presentation on Kenya, and I will tie that as well to that on Tanzania. I want to take my reference from Article 29, Paragraph 3 of the Kenya Constitution, who says that that individual rights or constitutional rights that are written in the Constitution belong to the individual. You know, I stress this because I think there's something about individual rights which we have kind of tended to discount in this gathering. Individual rights are entitlements that individuals have, not just entitlements that have urgency in terms of priority. In other words, if we truly have these rights, they trump community values. Otherwise, you really don't have the rights as such. And it's important to know this, because when we keep going back and having anthropological studies of Africa and saying, well, these things never do not quite fit with Africa of this pristine perspective, we have to realize that, yes, maybe, but something important has happened when we bring in individual rights. They command some special effect of their own. And I think that we need to bear that in mind. Otherwise, to say that the value of individual rights has to be determined by the value for the community may not be very, very appropriate. Because, for example, if you say I have a right to life, which is an individual right, the fact that my life is useless, the fact that my life is a burden on society, and the fact that society will be better off if I'm killed, doesn't take away that right. The same thing as torture. All of us agree that torture is not derogable. But what if, by just torturing me and picking up my teeth with some crude tools, and maybe I can confess to the fact that I have a bomb downstairs, and community will be glad for that. But we don't want to do that because we say he has a right not to be tortured. So it has some value. We shouldn't discount it. Yeah, we're going to debate that after my comment. Yeah, but the report from Tanzania shows as well that, you know, we are probably not ready to, African countries, it could be not just to Africa, but some other countries as well, not ready to let individual rights play the role it plays in terms of trumping policies in the West. I mean, when a minister says in Tanzania that nobody should debate gay marriage, otherwise you'll be in trouble. I mean, even the freedom of expression is taken away as a result. You know, that you cannot even talk about it. So because we do not really want even the freedom of expression to affect how we debate, how policies are made in our countries. So we minimize the value of these rights. For Professor Baba and Christina, yes, indeed, the CROC is probably the most ratified treaty in the world next to the Geneva Conventions. But it's also many countries, I won't say 1/3 of the countries that have ratified the CROC have reservations. They have reservations, and these reservations mean that they are not willing to carry out all the obligations under the treaty. And so we have to bear that in mind when we talk about the great achievement in ratification. I take my country, for example, which doesn't quite have the problem with that, but we're not able to even domesticate the child rights law in every state because some states object to it. That it's not consistent with their custom or with their cultural institutions and so on and so forth. And so there's a problem there, even though we are counted as one of those who have ratified the convention. You know, it's in connection with this paper that I mentioned anthropologists because David Kennedy and others were mentioned, and Professor Kafo by implication, third world scholars, international law, mentioned as well. Yeah. But I ask really that in a country, as in fact one or two or three countries in Africa where slavery is practiced, we'll say to these countries where, you know what, the right against slavery, which is one of the rights in the Universal Declaration on Human Rights and the Covenants of United Nations. They will say, well, you know, the rights against slavery it's not consistent with the culture of these people. And therefore, we should be careful about having it there. Or when ISIS says that they want to follow 7th century Islam and therefore are entitled to capture unbelievers and treat them as sex slaves, we say, well, we have different, where there's cultural relativity, and therefore this right should not apply. I think no. I think those women captured by ISIS have a right not to be violated. It doesn't matter the culture, as well as whoever is held in slavery in Africa. So there must be some absolutes, not resolving everything simply as a matter of these rights are not consistent with African culture as such. The point is made that we ratify the CROC, but people on the streets don't really know, they cannot connect with this. And therefore that explains probably why you have juveniles, too many juveniles in prison in Ghana. But look at it this way. In almost every other aspect of our criminal justice system, we're falling short. In Nigeria, 70% of people in prison are just suspects. They're not prisoners, they have not been sentenced for any offense. They're suspects. We have a United Nations minimum standard for treatment of prisoners, which we don't follow. But it doesn't mean that that's because these standards we can't relate to them. It's just that our institutions are weak. And so we should focus on how to improve our institutions and not simply to throw our hands into the air and say these things are Western standards which have no meaning for us. Finally, Maxwell, the first discussant, made a point about uncritical acceptance of foreign decisions by Kenyan courts. And although he gave the example only about facts in appellate system, but probably it has a larger role as well. My own view is that judicial dialogue has come to be accepted as something which is not only just a fact, but also something that is positive. I agree that there must be some discretion in following foreign precedents. After all, they're not binding on your court. You may decide to accept part of it and not everything, or even reject everything as it were. But we cannot deny the fact that if we have copied our individual rights from some foreign jurisdictions, would it make sense for us to also know how the courts in those jurisdictions have applied that, whether or not we're going to follow that system? In the United States Supreme Court, they are adverse to foreign judgments. They don't like it. And they always say, look, it doesn't apply to us. We don't follow that. Well, you can almost understand that because they regard their constitution as a native document, and they do not think that they emulated anybody in drafting their constitution. Maybe not. But that's at least one justification which they have. But the rest of us who have copied, like Nigeria, who copied from the European Convention on Human Rights, I think we should actually know how the European Court on Human Rights looks at some of these provisions. Whether or not we find them satisfactory or not, or otherwise, we should actually look at them. And I think that's the value of judicial dialogue.
Thank you. I think there are 2 points which Professor Obia wants to have the debate with about the individual later on. But I also think we need to talk about, as a non-lawyer here, the question around culture. I think it's perhaps requires some engagement.
Hi, I really enjoyed your presentation. It was very intriguing and very engaging. Thank you. My question is pretty straightforward, and if there is anything I didn't quite get right, let me know. You talked about ratification of the CRC as a political decision, one that seeks legitimacy, and if I may add, self-esteem, and tries to avoid the political consequences of non-ratification. In your research, did you find any indications of, the reasons for non-ratification of the African Charter? And if not, I'm curious about whether you have any theory as to why, for countries that haven't ratified it. You're welcome.
Yeah. Once we finish this round, then we'll come back again.
Okay, so I have a short sort of question for the last presenters. I missed the beginning, so I don't know if you touched on sort of if you try to. I'm a sociologist also, so similar to Ua, I'm very curious about this notion and of culture, especially in the Ghanaian context. And depending on which prison you went to, you'd probably be engaging different kinds of cultures in those situations. So I'm very curious about that as well. And I think you missed the big general debate where we're talking about, and Okafor was telling everyone about, how important it is to nuance these kinds of discussions, look at, the politics, these kinds of spaces. But then related to that, you talked about having a solution, even though you're sort of in this preliminary stage. And I was very curious, again, as a sociologist, we never are able to solve these problems because of how, challenging they are to even nail down. And I'm sure you can tell that from this and from the previous debate. So I was very curious. I was like, oh, wow, I should learn something from how to arrive at these solutions. So I'm curious to hear about that and sort of how you got to that. And in terms of Kenya, I just have a brief sort of question. I'm also really intrigued and happy about, the depth of engagement that you seem to be seeing in, not that I'm surprised, because I think it's sort of called Nairobi the NGO capital of the world. It has everybody and everything in there. So sometimes Kenya is also exceptionalist and, an exceptionalist sort of case in that situation. So thank you.
Okay. So I'll just go back to Christina.
Do you want me to come up?
No, you can respond from there.
Okay, so the first question about why CRC, why not ACRWC? Yeah, I mean, I was struck by this in the literature, and I think part of it and part of the reasons that were given was this publicity idea, and the idea is that why do countries want the international community to see them in a positive light? Well, because of resources. Because if you're seen as doing something that's approved of, that fits in with a global agenda, then you're going to be rewarded monetarily for this. So there is interest in pursuing something that's international as opposed to pursuing something that's regional for that reason. I mean, that's just one of the reasons. But that's kind of how I see it. So when those legislators were saying things like, oh, well, Ghana's just doing this because they want to look good. It's not just that. It goes, it's a little deeper than that. But people become very skeptical and very cynical about these things. So I hope that sort of helped. I'm still, we're still working on the paper, so preliminary answer. As to the solution that we were going to refer to but didn't have a chance to, and then I'll make a quick comment on culture because people keep talking about culture. So the solution was, okay, now I have to find it, sorry. Okay, the solution was about increasing transparency. So to overcome the problem of the political nature of these things, right? Because we said the problem is not so much that it's a political thing. We understand that it's political. It's when it's implicitly political. That means that it's hidden. That means that it's not out there for people to see and to know what's going on. So that's why one solution is to have a body that keeps countries accountable after they've ratified. And that's what the CRC has, the CRC committee, which is one such body. The ACRWC also has a committee to keep countries who've ratified these acts accountable for actually implementing them. And then I had a quote here from Doak that just says, it might seem like it's just paper pushing. You're just getting these countries to come out with these reports, but he's like, it's actually more than that. It's important that they go through this process of, they're also evaluating themselves while they're preparing these reports and sending them to the CRC and showing them, what they're doing with their resources and how they're actually implementing the articles from the act. And then the last comment is on culture, which I agree, and I apologize if anyone found that offensive or just not properly justified, but I definitely would have gone to the part where, we do talk about countries other than Ghana in the paper. It didn't come through in the presentation because we didn't have time. The other thing is, because we were talking about the African Charter on the Rights of the Child, that's why I felt comfortable saying Africa or saying African culture, because the things that I was talking about, like the difference in children having obligation towards their parents and things that are much more emphasized in that charter than they are in the CRC and than they are in Western thinking traditionally. So that's kind of why I felt comfortable saying African culture. Although in the next paper, I will definitely justify the use of the term, and I'll explain that it's not just one country that I'm focusing on, but it was. Yeah, in this paper we focus on more countries than one. Yeah.
But even still, I mean, I think that. Sorry for interrupting. I mean, I think that it's the term itself is problematic enough that it would need to be explained and conceptualized of what you mean exactly by that.
Sure.
Because it's not a one. I mean, I think there's a tendency to treat Africa as a country, which you're aware of. That
Right.
it's not. And then even within countries, there's so many diverse communities to sort of speak of one culture, even within one country, isn't something that necessarily resonates. And so you are going to get pushed back on that if you're here. And so I think it makes sense to address it in this current case.
Yeah, thank you.
So I wanted to respond to the other comments about our paper, but on the issue of culture, I think it's worth saying, like, nobody agrees on what culture means. There is no definition. There's no authority on what that means, and so it's always fraught. But that's not a reason to avoid talking about it. And I think what we used in a very, very narrow sense, and that was to infer an alternative cultural construction of human rights from the African Charter. So we're not talking about African culture in any sort of abstract way or any of the problematic ways that overgeneralizations are made. But if you accept the assumption of the Twale critique that international human rights actually represents a Western cultural conception of what human rights are, if you accept that, then you can accept at least as a thought experiment that the African culture, the African Charter will represent or embody some conception of an African cultural construction of human rights. Now, that doesn't mean that it accurately reflects every African person's conception of their own culture or their own self-definition of culture.
Yeah, but one can.
But it's a construction. It's a cultural construction of human rights from an African perspective.
I mean, I guess for someone like me that is outside law, right? I mean, before Mutua and Obi, you had Fela, right? I felt Fela is the first Twela. He said, human right is my property. You can't dash me my property. Right? I mean, I don't know how to translate that in English. You know, it's pidgin English. So he's saying that, like, I mean, human right is his. Like, he's already human, and so he has human rights. So the idea that, like, he has to be given in human rights in some sense within the historical specificity of independence in Africa reinforces this idea that he wasn't human in the first place. Now he has to be recognized as human. But the point, to the point, I guess we are raising with regards to the meaning of culture is it isn't that the fact that Twale has, by necessity, I think, given the unequal power relationship, acknowledged the Western origin of international human rights law. That doesn't then correspondingly mean that one can simply define culture in the African sense, right? The reason being that if we think of cultures as network of representation, text, talk, and images, and the narrative structure organizing this that shape every aspect of social life. In fact, one could argue it's a bunch of elites sitting down somewhere in Addis Ababa who decided what what the ACR looks like. That has literally nothing to do with my grandmother in the village, right? So that's the problematic that in an African context, given its significant unequal power relationship, it's when you use African culture, you unintentionally, I agree, essentializes a significant amount of diversity and create what Chimamanda has called the danger of a single story. Right? And that becomes the counterweight to the alternative. So the problem isn't necessarily that one cannot speak of the African culture in that sense. It is that it's perhaps better to kind of like be more clear about what certain practices or what certain discourses you are engaging with within the realm of the framework that you're talking about, as opposed to using the word African culture that presupposes, that kind of like homogenizes unintentionally because of the historicity of the very use of the word culture historically. I mean, so that's the danger, I guess.
No, I get that. And I think depending on one's discipline, one can get stuck at that point, or one can sort of work through the problems in language to clarify one's intentions for the specific project in any event, right? So I mean, lawyers tend to deploy language for purely utilitarian purposes in a particular setting, and that was our intention. I just want, and I think this ties back to the idea of universalism versus particularism.
Yeah.
The point that I wanted to touch on. You know, what do reservations mean in the context of the CRC? Well, it illustrates to me a paradox on the emotional sense of universality of children's rights. Everybody wants to agree that children's rights are universal, that the best interests of the child is a decent standard, that the right to life, especially when attached to the child, that the rights to some sort of minimum core of economic, social baseline is especially important. All of the human rights we want to believe are universal become even more important when we think about children. But then, at the same time, children touch on the most personal of the spheres, the most private zones of the family, areas of control that we want to control and have exclusive control over, and resist the application of law. And so I think that explains the paradox of the near universal ratification of the treaty and the near universal expression of reservations and conditions. And I think that in and of itself is a microcosm of debates about culture and what culture means and how culture plays out in political choices as well as in rights talk. And I don't think we can disentangle any of that. And just so, you know, issues like slavery, polygamy, and FGM are fantastic issues to highlight this paradox. Whether we can resolve the paradox by examining those sorts of issues is another question. I spent my graduate research examining the question of FGM in North America under conceptions of multiculturalism here and constitutional rights structures, and attempted to argue for an accommodation and a pluralist approach to culture within liberal constitutionalism using FGM as a test case. And so to those who worry about the potential of us having a tendency to essentialize culture, I think, you know, I've been working through these issues in my own research for some time, and generally do not shy away from those difficult engagements on matters that are deeply embedded in culture, and we'll continue to work through these issues from that perspective. We certainly take all of the comments with a lot of appreciation.
I guess Professor Sylvia, Udoka.
As the question I asked, Juliana wanted to respond, and Professor Sylvia wanted to respond.
You have, Professor Sylvia will respond. Juliana will respond first, then Professor Sylvia. Then I'll just one set of questions, then I'll get to come in.
Thank you, Dr. Basil. You have asked if things have changed. Okay. They changed in 1984. It was, yes.
Okay.
So, Professor Solomon, on the question of Article 29 of the Kenyan Constitution, which says individual rights belong to the individual, and the bigger question, whether we are erasing individual rights, and that is not a good move. I think I agree with you, but I agree with you for the following reasons. First, acknowledging that there has been a tyranny of individual rights, for instance, the rights of property. But maybe with new jurisprudence and new constitutions, that tyranny might be pushed back sufficiently to allow individual rights to sort of be less controversial, or to be to have the place you want them to have, which is they actually matter, they actually are in the Constitution. But we don't need to fear them, that they will create a tyranny that takes all our resources out of Africa, for example. The other reason I agree with you is that there has actually been good use of individual rights, especially in the area of free free press and democratization. So I do think that we ought to support individual rights. The third is there has also been support of individual rights within community rights, so that you can have a community that has its own regime of land rights, but also within that recognizes individual rights. So individual rights are not are good actually in those contexts, even as we ring fence and say that only community members will enjoy them. Then fourth, there is a way to limit individual rights, and the Constitution does that, in the sense that individual rights are not absolute. They will yield to other interests, to state interests, to the rights of other, say, anti-discrimination protections of women, minorities, and so on. You couldn't waive your property rights and say you can discriminate because you have individual rights in that sense. So long as we are engaging in a conversation that properly contextualizes individual rights, I think we should be fine. On the second question regarding critical acceptance of decisions of uncritical acceptance of decisions of foreign courts, you correctly point out that judicial dialogue has come to be accepted as a positive thing, so long as there are appropriate limits. So I ask myself, as we are citing Canadian decisions in Kenya, would Canadians cite our decisions? Would there be dialogue? Has to be dialogue, right? And then the other thing, this is the second point, and it goes back to, I think it was Halima's question. Let us also remember it's a resource issue. We may not have precedent unless we look at what the Canadian courts are doing, because maybe decisions made by our courts are not available online, and our judges or whatever can only rely on what is digitized right now. So because of the resource problem, we get to cite foreign decisions. However, as that resource gap is breached, then we might see less reliance on judicial decisions. Professor, no, one more thing, politics. Why are Kenyans so happy to embrace the foreign? Why isn't there more, critical? Why are we taking these decisions whole cloth, as Maxwell was pointing out? I wonder about that as well. Should we politicize this more? Maybe. Now, to Professor Bauer's comment, she says Nairobi is a world capital of NGOs. That may well be true. I do not know. But this question has been raised by more than one person, Professor Bauer. So maybe let me stop playing around and actually answer it. So my, my thoughts. One, the career decisions of Westerners. They are, in Africa and other places, would probably be concentrated in certain capitals. And Nairobi is one of them. There's a study that was done by PricewaterhouseCoopers ranking, the big or the business-friendly or the big destinations in Africa, and Nairobi was one of them among others. So career decisions of Westerners, they'll tend to concentrate in certain capitals. Even if they are working in other countries, they might still be based in Nairobi. So, and within Nairobi itself, there'll be further segregation, as they might have their own zones where, they have their own shopping malls. You'll never really see them in other parts of the city. So there might be that. There is also a global marketing urban culture that may have roots in colonialism, and it turns out that Kenya was a favored colonial destination because it's on the equator, the climate is good, and so on and so forth. There might be that, and the animals that Obi was talking about. So the fair trade animals and and all that might be that. And then there is security and infrastructure. Security is increasingly becoming a question. There's a time I worked in Somalia, and we had to stay within the UN zone, which has layers of military security. You couldn't get out of that. So if one didn't have access to UN infrastructure, you wouldn't go there. You probably end up in Nairobi. Now, something to note, and this comes from, this is not Western at all. The Chinese who are in Africa now, it's so visible, it's really interesting and something that we also ought to take into account. And I'm not saying good or bad or anything, I'm just saying they are in Kenya as a gateway into other parts of Africa, right? So that is a different sort of, so not so Western. The Western careerist will settle in Nairobi but work in Somalia or Sudan or wherever. The Chinese will go to Sudan or wherever. So Nairobi is just getting into Africa, sort of, it's a gateway. So I hope I have tried.
All right, I think I'll just get Obi to just comment, then I'll take just two.
Hopefully briefly, because Solomon's comments, perhaps in his passionate defense of human rights on the ground, he got lost conceptually, I think. So I was a bit, I mean, the comments were provocative in a good way in terms of eliciting thoughts. So I'm sure Solo surely would agree that the absolutist rights are not always a good thing. You know, tell that to the natives of Canada about absolutist property rights, right? So history matters, context matters.
What about torture?
No, but that's what I'm saying. I said not always. A good thing. So I'm saying you have a point, but I think you went too far with it, right? So it's all contextual and historical. You have to bring in again. You know, you have this sort of riff against anthropologists throughout your talk, but it does matter. It does matter. A view from 30,000 feet can give us the wrong impression, right? So when we get down to the nitty-gritty of the living law, property rights are not always a good thing. Rights against torture may be a good thing. I've written that they're a good thing in absolute terms. So, but I think that it's a little more complex than individual rights must trump policy. I don't think individual rights must always trump policy. Rights in themselves are not ends. Rights are resources that we deploy to produce an end. That end is the good life. So the moment we start to think of rights as ends, we get lost. So some guy wants to just enjoy his right to whistle down the hall, swinging a long sword that may cut the nose of Westerners, because we have flat noses. We are not at risk. You know, is his right, but his right ends where my nose begins, right? So it's a resource to produce. So immediately we are looking at a good life, teleological. We see what rights get us there, and the rights that get us there in every society at every point T in history are not always the same thing. They're not always the same. So in terms of the living human rights, on paper, I agree with you, so on paper, but in terms of, so I know that it's almost anathema to say there must be prioritization in terms of emphasis. The kind of investment that you put, for example, to rescue some place where you have parts of the country, Nigeria, for example, have 90% literacy rate. Parts of them have 20% literacy rate. We can't do the same project there in terms of human rights, right? And we're talking about Nigeria, what more the world, right? So I guess that's the provocation that you brought out with your statement. Not that I disagree with you.
Oh, I disagree with you.
Generally. No, in general.
Oh, you want to go? Oh, that is
Is it a mistake?
I didn't know we're going to get a second chance. No, but the point is that the liberal concept of individual rights is what it is. It is not for a better life. It's true that within the framework of justice, yes, but the end of the right is the right itself. In other words, let me explain to you. The man who is whistling and disturbing everybody in this complex has exceeded his right. So at that point, you say, no, you don't look at it as a right. But where is within his own right? I give the example already of the right to life. That my life is useless, and I'm in a body society, Society will be better off if they can get rid of me, because to save them the cost of having to take care of me. Society will be better off. But yet, my right to life means that right will have to be honored. Society cannot say, well, we'll be better off, so let's just kill him off.
Well, what is the death penalty for?
No, that's for punishment. No, but no, yeah, but that's not because I lead a bad life.
And it's legal.
That's not because I live a bad life. That's not because I'm a burden of society, but because
but it's a bad life.
It's a bad life. It's a bad life.
You want the death penalty? We can argue about whether it is
I don't support
the violation of the right to life or otherwise. Frank, my concern, maybe I've made my point, but my concern.
That's where we are.
Yeah, my concern is not with sociologists and culture.
Yeah.
I have a little concern about anthropological perspective. The notion that Africa has remained the way it is. Now, if you want to find out anything about Africa anthropologically, go to a rural setting, go to the village. That is Africa. I'm saying that Africa is more complex than that, in the sense that the person living in Accra or in Lagos is actually a little bit removed from the roots that you get in the villages. And you have to consider all this. I want to insist that Africa would not do without individual rights. It's not all in all, but I want to insist that if we are going to respect human rights as human dignity, surely there must be a place for regarding your rights as not use the word absolute, but as priority. You talk about, say, property. What do you have property rights? Can you imagine if you're in a society where your jacket you are wearing will not be just when you leave this room? Someone says, well, let me have it. Because you don't have a right to property. John Locke told us that.
Right to property in Canada.
Yeah, John Locke told us that when you extend your possession, when you appropriate a thing, that appropriation of the thing becomes part of yourself. And in other words, that claim which you make over the thing, that possession itself, is not part of yourself. And that's exactly how human beings live. We appropriate things, and we have to own things. And if your possession to this jacket wasn't secure by law, life would be meaningless.
No, but it doesn't have to be secure by human rights.
No,
that's two different things.
But I mean, we're assuming that the idea of property right itself is a modern concept, right?
Exactly.
So
and you keep citing law.
Yeah.
I see a pattern. So liberal, I cited fella.
No, but so in fairness, I'm not an anthropologist, but I feel I should help them out a little bit. I think, one has to, the discipline of anthropology, I think, has evolved significantly over time. The pre-colonial and colonial discipline as anthropology and today are quite different. And the question that I think anthropologists, or the question about culture, which I think we need to we need to talk about a little bit about, is to understand that culture is not a thing, right? It's not something that is out there that you just take and deploy. Culture is actually a function of social relationship and therefore a site of contestation and unequal power relationship, right? So just because someone says picking your nose is a bad thing, all of a sudden we all agree and now we take it as given that it's culturally wrong to pick your nose, right? But certainly at some point that wasn't seen as a bad thing, and that wasn't a question that was considered something wrong or socially unacceptable. So part of the question for me has to be, you are right that there would always be tension between individual right on one hand and communal right on the other hand. In other words, there are places where they in fact cohere, and there are places where there's a tension, right? And the question is what priority is made and who is making that priority and for what purpose. And that's where the unequal power relationship, I think, comes in. I'll just take two speakers. I know Udoka wanted to ask a question. And Nadesha, do you still want to say anything?
Oh, I just had a quick question.
Okay, so I'll just take the two of you, then I'll get to you two.
Okay. I'm just, I think mostly what I have to say, there are comments. One might be masquerading as a question, actually. But the first thing is just to underscore Obe's point about the political dynamic or political economy to ratification of international conventions and instruments. Because you said, the Convention on the Rights of the Child is ratified, whereas the African one wasn't. And it's not something that is limited to just the rights of the child. If you actually look at African countries as well, and the way they ratify, the global instruments and the regional instruments. So for example, if you look at the Basel Convention on a hazardous movement of waste, which is far, gives so little as against the Bamako Convention, which is more African and is more beneficial to Africans, you would find that more African countries have ratified the Basel Convention and haven't ratified the Bamako Convention. Again, because you find that a lot of trade, a lot of business is also tied, or aid is also tied to don't ratify the Bamako Convention. So that this is something, it's not peculiar to the Convention on the Rights of the Child. And for Professor Sylvia, and I think also this train might be late for Misozi, because I think in your papers you talked about, your papers showed that there was a fraud regarding the funds that Canada had brought into Kenya and had brought into Zambia. And I wanted to say that perhaps this is also an aspect of the engagement, to interrogate the engagement, because the whole idea of looking at the engagement is also to highlight the problems of the engagement. And in highlighting this problem would be now in this end, for us to critique the modus or the mechanisms or lack thereof for the disbursement of these funds. Has Canada just taken the funds and dumped into the hands of corrupt government officials? What have they done? How have they put things in place? Because I know, for example, when I was doing some of the research regarding Nigeria, if you look at some of the sites, you would see that, for example, regarding, even though this paper never made it to this one, on IDPs, you would see, for example, that the money was given to the UNHCR, the money is given to certain, so it never got really into the hands of the government. So to look at this, to interrogate this, as part of the engagement, really. And then this is for Julena, but more really to Efodu, or number 2. Now, Okay had talked about, it seemed as though Canada was this, champion of the rights of children. Canada being the champion of or projecting this image of being a champion of the rights of children. Now, and yes, Canada has done quite a bit in terms of the rights of children. If you even, from the pilot project, the Canadian-Nigerian, human rights engagement, we saw quite a bit that had been done there. I think that's also where was drawing from, because he did quite a bit. But again, regarding Julena, it seemed not just to your paper as well as to what was saying and the pilot scheme, that it seemed as though Canada, while it had done quite a bit regarding children's rights, it avoided the issue of African cosmology. And this is where your paper comes in. You're talking about children and witchcraft, the rights of children and witchcraft. And we know this is a problem. For example, even in Nigeria and Canada, they would give for immunization for a child, and this is clearly an issue that they stepped out of. So to what extent perhaps culture is important here, or is not important? And Canada has avoided engaging African cosmology or dealing with African cosmology. And we know, again, now from Nigeria, and thankfully from your paper, that we've seen that there is a big issue regarding the rights of children who are, for some reason, when there are issues of witchcraft that are involved. And so thank you for that. So these are pretty much my comments.
I just have a quick question for the last paper, which is actually based on a personal interest of mine, and it was to your answer on the solution that you're proposing in your paper. And I have to disclose, I haven't read the paper, so what I'm going to ask is based on your presentation, but mostly actually on the question, because we haven't had time to hear what actually that solution of transparency is actually going to play out. Because, as I said, my personal interest is that I did my PhD on the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. And the exciting thing about this initiative, so EITI in short, is that transparency has been sold as this big solution, right? And it's existed for over a decade now. And what we found was that you can't actually translate transparency into accountability that easily. And from your answer, I seem to glean that the solution is more accountability than it is transparency. And you acknowledge some of the criticisms that the transparency movement in this field, I guess, has encountered, in that the reports, the people promoting the reports are saying that it's more than that. So I just wondered whether you can explain a bit further what the more part is in terms of the mechanism to actually translate increased transparency into increased accountability. Because as a quick example for the EITI, for instance, you have a huge number of countries that are mineral rich and oil rich that are now compliant with this initiative, but it hasn't in any way actually increased accountability. There's a lot of research that has now been done on that, and it's still ongoing. Not to say that transparency is not important, but that we're just kind of stuck on how to actually translate the transparency into accountability. So I would be very keen to hear whether you have similar issues or challenges in your specific research, and if not, especially with the concept of solution is quite exciting to hear if you have found something at all. Thanks.
So I'll just let Barbara.
Well, yeah, I think, when we say solution, we don't mean solution capital S, big picture solution. We might have overpromised and underdelivered, like Kennedy says the international human rights movement does in proposing a solution. I think what we're saying is we need, at minimum, evidence and facts and information, and that's what we find is really lacking. We weren't consciously triggering a kind of critical review of transparency and accountability initiatives in international development practices and rule of law initiatives and other things, or anti-corruption initiatives, if those are the sorts of things that you're looking at. It was more from the perspective of how to address the concerns that the critical scholarship raises about the international humanitarian movement, the advocacy movement, how to strengthen the hand of human rights advocates on the ground and working with international networks. Advocacy needs to be built from facts, built on facts, not on and set in context. And this is where I think what Obi was saying resonates for us and for our project. Because I think we do ascribe to this view, and underlying our paper is this tension between are human rights an end unto themselves, or are they a means to an end? And I don't think we're going to resolve that question. I think we accept, for the purpose of this paper, that human rights ought to be seen as a means to an end. And in order to best instrumentalize human rights, you've got to have an accurate picture of the facts on the ground. So I think that's how we would avoid some of the concerns that you raise around transparency, accountability, review in the way that those have been formalized. We're talking about more democratization of children's rights advocacy itself, and empowering the ability of NGOs to do their work. Yeah, I think that was all I wanted to say in response to that last question. And any other comment you want to add to that?
I was just going to say, also in terms of, we definitely didn't engage with a difference between transparency and accountability. But what I was going to say is that what we flag in the paper is that, we try to pin it down to resources. A lot of the time, that is why accountability doesn't happen, is because of lack of resources. So there kind of is an answer, although of course that answer itself just raises a lot more questions. So that's sort of our not real solution, but just a solution that has existed that we're gonna canvas.
Yeah. All right, thanks. Just very quickly, thank you everyone. I just have one question to just add to the conversation. Following Jake's celebration of Canada's financial generosity to Africa. As a scholar of international development, that bothered me greatly. yes, because there is an extensive amount of literature around foreign aid and its implications. So my quickest response in thinking around the engagement is really the proverbial anthropological theory or gift theory. So I'll just say it very quickly, that in a market transaction, you want to buy my cell phone, and I say my cell phone is $2. Like, you give me $2, and I pick up the cell phone, our relationship starts and ends in the marketplace, and we go. But when you say you like my cell phone, I give you my cell phone, and you take it and you're happy. You know, I know that you are owing me, but you don't know when you're going to pay it back. Okay? So in that sense, I guess my point is, in thinking about Canadian funding or in terms of engagement with Africa, we have to be careful not to be deceived by the figment of our imagination around the representations of those given, and actually engage with both the politics, the meaning, and of course, the interest at play that this process of giving actually enshrine, and in some sense, but yeah, I mean, I guess the point really, I think it's that engagement has to be seen that the people engaging are not just apolitical actors, which Obi's point earlier in the model, it's a political process. That interest and power are quite significant in the process of engagement, right? But more importantly, I think the other question also has to be the ways in which this process of engagement actually serve to legitimize certain kind of views, certain kind of positions, and certain kind of interests, and in the process delegitimize others. So it's not by accident that everybody is interested in FGM or female circumcision, or right, versus, for example, malaria or healthcare, or take, for example, the issue of corruption, that everybody's talking about AITI, whereas all the money that leaves Africa comes to the bank in the West. My argument is very simple: ensure that no money that is stolen from Africa comes to the West, and let them keep stealing. At least we know one day we'll get it back. Anyway, I'll call Obi to take over.